Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SETA DC again. Today we will discuss with our panel the implications of a potential operation in Idlib in northwestern Syria. As you all know by now, Syria conflict, it is more than 7 years now, and it is again at a critical juncture. It's a critical juncture geopolitically, diplomatically, militarily, and in terms of its potential humanitarian consequences. And we have an excellent panel here to discuss the different dimensions of this conflict and potential crisis. On my left, Charles Lister from Middle East Institute. You can find their bios, by the way, in your handout. Sasha Ghosh-Siminoff from People Demand Change, and Nick Heras from the CNES, Center for New American Security, and Kadir Ustun from SETA DC. And we will start with short presentations, remarks from the panelists, and we will start with Charles. And Charles will tell us several things, who is who in Idlib, and why Idlib itself is so important for the crisis in Syria.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Proud to be here and to talk about a critically important subject, which I think policymakers for too long have been ignoring, which is the fate of this northwestern pocket of Syria. I thought what would be interesting to start off would be to sort of present a bigger picture look of where the crisis in Syria is, how we've got to where we are, and then leading up to why that makes the situation and the fate of Idlib province so critically important. So to start off, I think for anyone who's been observing the conflict in Syria, the conflict has transformed dramatically over the last 12 months. I think the trajectory we're on towards an international acceptance of a de facto Assad survival, I would avoid necessarily using the term victory, is now an inevitability. The question really is, what are the consequences of that? How do we get to that eventuality? And where does the international community stand with what the consequences or the implications are for that? But the reason, really, the mechanism through which how we've got to the point at which we have is de-escalation. This was, at least in my terminology, a Russian ploy to convince the international community that A, it was possible to de-escalate the conflict, B, that for humanitarian reasons that was necessary, and C, that that would encourage or pave a path towards a political settlement for the conflict. Now, all of those things are true. But the consequence, the natural consequence of that de-escalation design has been the kind of Assad survival / victory that we see today. Prior to the start of de-escalation 12 months ago, the Assad regime had an existential manpower issue. It had no capacity to defend, let alone go on the offensive on multiple fronts all across the country. The natural solution to that was to pause conflict all across the country, single out those 4 critically important areas of opposition control in eastern Ghouta, in southwestern Syria, around Homs and in Idlib. And one by one, which is exactly what we've seen, the regime has fixed its manpower problem by taking each of those areas one by one, with little international consequence. Idlib now is the only one remaining. So the consequences or the implications of its loss are very, very significant, not so much for the consequences or the conclusions of the military conflict, but for where Syria goes next and for the shape and the trajectory of the discussion around political negotiations, which I think really is where Russia is seeking to point us towards now. So the momentum today is clearly, as I say, with the Assad regime, but that doesn't equal victory. The regime continues to struggle with issues of domestic sustainability, whether financially, militarily, and even politically. Its manpower issue continues to exist. In fact, there are some who think the reason why we still haven't seen this offensive in Idlib start is because there still aren't enough men on the ground to take the entire, potentially, province of Idlib all at once. There's still an issue of international legitimacy, domestic legitimacy and credibility. 6 million, potentially 7 million Syrians currently reside outside of the country. Russia wants all of those people to be coming back. The regime, I think, is making it patently clear it doesn't want those people back. One obvious example recently was the head of Syria's Air Force Intelligence Directorate, the most powerful of Syria's 4 intelligence agencies, Jamil Hassan said in a series of comments that the Syrian government right now has the names of at least 3 million refugees who are all wanted on terrorism charges, i.e. in plain language, they're all serving death penalties, or they will do if they come back to the country. The message being you have a 50-50 chance of coming back to the country and being captured and sentenced to death, i.e. we don't want you back. But the Russians do. The Russians are positioning the international community and the conflict dynamics on the ground towards a political settlement. It's one reason why the so-called small group of non-Astana states have been meeting in Geneva to talk about ironing out the constitutional issues, which the Russians and the Astana group have been talking about over the last few months. And there are many other reasons to justify that point. But the reason why I open up with this kind of big picture look is that that is precisely why the fate of this last de-escalation zone is so important. The consequence of the fall of the 3 other de-escalation zones is that we've seen Idlib become, I hate this term, but the dumping ground for surrendered and displaced Syrians from elsewhere in the country. Idlib is now home to at least 3 million people, and yet Idlib only represents roughly 3% of Syria's national territory. So it is an immeasurable humanitarian crisis waiting to happen that will far eclipse anything that we've seen happen in Syria over the last 7.5 years. Idlib remains home to a series of designated terrorist organizations, both in Turkey and in the rest of the international community. But these terrorist organizations are not like ISIS. They have not distinguished themselves from the broader agenda of the local Syrian revolution. They have embedded themselves in that agenda. Why do I highlight that? Because what we will inevitably see from a Russian, Iranian, and regime offensive is a scorched earth strategy, like we've seen elsewhere in the country. And whilst that may have very well have been effective in displacing Syrians, there is now nowhere for these second triply displaced people in Idlib to go. And most importantly for me, as someone who focuses on armed groups and in particular on the more extremist end of the spectrum, that scorched earth strategy and the desperate humanitarian situation that will result will empower the narrative of the extremist groups, particularly one called Heras, which used to be known as Jabhat al-Nusra. This is a group that has spent the last 7 years trying to prove to the people, ultimately unsuccessfully, that it is part and parcel of the Syrian revolution. And the reason why I highlight that it's been unsuccessful in that is because this, a scorched earth strategy on Idlib, is their last best hope for rescuing an element of credibility within the local population. Sure, 3 million people aren't going to join Heras or IHTS tomorrow. But if 10,000 people do, because their more moderate armed groups no longer have sources of support and international legitimacy, that doubles the terrorist force that we all supposedly want to deal with. So what is needed is a much more complex and, dare I say it, a more long-term strategy which focuses more on intelligence resources, which focuses more on leveraging political negotiations, on making the more moderate opposition credible on a political and diplomatic stage, that isolates this group further, that forces the issue to break it up, to prove who it really is, and to finally single it out from the rest of the opposition. But I fear that's not what we're going to be seeing. So I've probably already talked for too long, but Sasha made one specific request of me beforehand, which was to talk specifically about the armed groups on the ground, other than IHTS. And these are the group which by and large, the Turkish government controls on the ground. The main one, when we're talking about Idlib and some peripheral areas around that province, and we'll soon see a map, I think, if we can't already yet, is an umbrella called the National Liberation Front, which is an umbrella that has expanded and come together over the last several months, which basically encompasses almost every single armed opposition group in northwestern Syria, including all of the various groups that had previously been vetted and received Western assistance, and a series of other more mainstream, albeit Islamist opposition groups that hadn't been cooperating with the international community, but had sort of proven themselves over a long period of time as a mainstream element of the Syrian revolution. And I would suggest that that force, the NLF, currently constitutes at least 20,000 fighters in northwestern Syria. So they're almost at least double in number what IHTS, the main sort of issue that we have at hand, constitutes. And then when you spread across east along the map, the other areas of the map which are important to be looking at are the Turkish-controlled zones of northern Aleppo, the recently captured area of Afrin, and then next to it, what's commonly known as Euphrates Shield Zone. Within those two zones, collectively, we have something called the Syrian National Army, which is another kind of umbrella, predominantly, again, constituting Free Syrian Army-affiliated factions that historically have worked closely with the international community. I'm unsure, frankly, on their numbers. They're probably at least half of what the NLF constitutes, but they've received military training from the Turkish armed forces. They have probably a more clear command and control structure than the NLF. So whilst they are accused of a variety of corrupt practices on specific local areas, they appear to be at least somewhat more organized and under the command of the Turkish military, perhaps more so than in Idlib. But those two factions are key factions to watch here when we consider the potential for an offensive in Idlib, particularly considering the idea that the SNA, the Syrian National Army, may end up moving to Idlib as a further kind of deterrence move by the Syrian opposition and by Turkey to deter or to limit or to contain a pro-regime offensive in the northwest. So that's kind of my big picture look. It probably sounds a lot like I've gone into the weeds, but I'm sure we can explore some of it more in questions.
Thank you. Sasha, what are the potential military strategies and probably the potential humanitarian consequences of an operation in Idlib?
Sure. So I think it's first and foremost to think about the geography we're looking at when trying to understand what's happening on the ground. If you look at some of the maps, you'll see the opposition-held areas of Idlib, Western Aleppo province, Northern Hama province, and a small sliver of Latakia province. This constitutes the Northwest opposition pocket, and also it's the Northwest de-escalation zone that was agreed upon during the Astana talks between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Unlike other areas, Turkey has an extreme interest in making this de-escalation zone work, in part because of the long border that this area has with Turkey. Also, Turkey has been supportive of the opposition in this part of the country for quite some time. They're very familiar with the players on the ground, and they've also accepted 3 million Syrian refugees from all over the country, but in particular, they have quite a high number of refugees either from Idlib province, Aleppo province, or even parts of Latakia and Hama province. So the refugees who are in southern Turkey especially have families and connections and ties to the land of the Northwest opposition pocket. Realistically, this area has also been outside of the Assad regime's control since 2012, 2013 time. But the initial stages of where you start to see pockets of opposition control very early on in the revolution are, other than in the south, they're also in Idlib. And so people have had a lot of time to work on local governance structures, social service provision, and they also have a lot of communication and links with the international community and a number of the INGOs that are providing humanitarian assistance on the ground. So for people working in this field, they're very familiar with Idlib, they're very familiar with the people on the ground there and familiar with the communities. As Charles mentioned, it's also the place where you've had numerous parts of the Syrian population who were either forcibly displaced or agreed under duress to leave their areas. They end up in Idlib. So at this point, you can say if the original population of Idlib was around 1.5 million before the war, probably 500,000 either fled to Turkey or are displaced elsewhere, and you have the injection of an additional 2 million IDPs. So this is the current sort of demographic makeup. 2 million are IDPs, 1 million are original residents. So that gives you an idea of the scope and nature of this conflict over the last 7 years and what it's done to Syria's demographic makeup and how it has also changed the landscape specifically within Idlib. The current composition of the pocket, geographically speaking, has been stable since about January of this year, after the Assad regime and its Iranian proxies made an offensive to take sections of opposition-held Western Aleppo province in the south and a section of Idlib province also at the sort of juncture of the Aleppo and Hama borders. Since then, this is the area that we have available for the opposition. And it's very crowded. Every major municipality, town, city, village, are filled to the brim with IDPs. Social services are strained. The ability for the international community to continue providing services to keep all these people alive is difficult. A lot of it has to be done via cross-border through Turkey. And every day it's a struggle because anytime you rehabilitate infrastructure or you move forward, the regime or the Russians bomb that infrastructure and then you have to start again. So this has been the life for many of these people for the last 7, 6, 5 years. Numerous groups of people within this pocket have been displaced 2, 3, 4 times. Sometimes they'll be displaced for a few months when the Russians focus their energy on bombing a specific city. And then once bombing goes down, people will return to that municipality and pick up the pieces of their lives again. So it's really not a stable way to live. At the moment, what we're seeing is a potential attack on the pocket from 3 different angles. One around northern Hama province. So in this area where you see on the map says Morik observation post, you could see a potential attack there. Also, there's the potential for an attack in western Idlib, Latakia border province area near the Jabal Turkman observation point, and also the potential for an attack in Aleppo suburbs just outside of Aleppo city near the Jabal Akil observation point, sort of in the right-hand corner of the map. I suspect, based on what I've seen in terms of the airstrikes and artillery barrages we've seen in the last 13 days, it is a potential that you could see a 3-pronged attack on the pocket. Specifically, the attack would be designed to create a very complex military environment in which the opposition's command and control and ability to respond and defend would be under a lot of pressure and strain. Because remember, the opposition's biggest weakness thus far has been command and control and having the ability for all the different opposition military factions to unite under one cohesive umbrella. And that's why what Turkey has tried to do over the past year or so is to create those command and control parameters so that a defense of this large area with this kind of terrain could be possible. In the same time, we have seen that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and a lot of its higher ups and commanders have come to help supplement the regime's command and control structures. So there is the possibility to engage in such a complex military environment and actually succeed. So this is kind of what we're looking at. In one of the maps we created, we show kind of the different stages you could potentially see a campaign happening. Again, it would be important for the regime to kind of take the peripheries of the Idlib pocket first and then push further in, squeezing further in from all sides. As this happens, you could see potentially 500,000 people on the move within a matter of days, fleeing.
Are these the red dots?
On the map, if you see, stage 1 is in white, stage 2 is in yellow, stage 3 is in orange, and stage 4 is in red. Stage 4 is in red in part because it's very difficult and it's where you have a higher concentration of HTS fighters. We don't actually know what HTS will do if there is an invasion, if they will stay neutral, if they will fight, if they will simply dissolve and try and hide themselves. No one is clear, but what is clear is that whether it's the opposition or Turkey, if they want to hold this pocket, they have to contend with the possibility of fighting HTS and the regime simultaneously, which would be very, very complicated and pose an extreme problem for the opposition if they're trying to defend while having potentially 500,000 or 1 million people all fleeing the conflict at the same time. So there's going to be a lot of elements at play all at the same time, and it's not clear where we're going to go from here. But the humanitarian element, I think, is key. And frankly, there's not a lot of places for people to run to in this type of scenario where you have this tightening noose, I could foresee most people running towards the Syrian-Turkish border, where there's a road that takes you along the border, and slowly but surely making their way north towards the Afrin district, which is now under the control of the Turkish-backed opposition. But there's been a great deal of work to keep HTS elements out of the northern Aleppo province pocket. And if you have tens of thousands of people showing up at the border to try and enter, it would be very hard for anyone to know who is HTS and who is not. So they're not necessarily going to be allowed immediate entrance into that Turkish-held pocket. So there's a lot of things to consider, but regardless, I think any sort of invasion would result in a massive humanitarian catastrophe that would be very difficult for the international community to proactively respond to.
Thank you very much. And Nick, the policy options for the US, President Trump tweeted, and there were several statements by the State Department in regards to the humanitarian consequences of mostly chemical attacks. But what does it mean, and what are the policy options right now for United States if there is chemical attack and if there is no chemical attack at all?
Thank you, Kilic, and thank you to Charles and to Sasha for setting the scene so effectively well. I will try to make some brief remarks regarding what I view as the two main challenges for U.S. policy with the greater Idlib crisis. The first is to deter Bashar al-Assad and his allies, predominantly Russia and Iran, from waging a campaign against greater Idlib that would result in an additional humanitarian catastrophe, the likes of which we have not yet seen in the Syrian conflict. The United Nations estimates that over the course of 2018, approximately 1 million people have been displaced as a result of the conflict, which is the highest year on record. And the estimate is almost 1 million people further would be triply or newly displaced or quadruply displaced, as Charles had mentioned, to other points, including potentially Afrin. We already have 170,000 people that have been displaced, predominantly Kurds. The challenge with deterrence is that requires several decision points by the Trump administration that it hasn't been willing to do to this point in the conflict and really over the course of this year. As has been outlined already, the de-escalation zone scheme, which was hatched as part of the Assad process, has allowed the Assad government and its allies to pick apart main opposition-controlled areas. And over the summer, we saw this first moment of truth, where the Trump administration, which had highlighted the Southwest de-escalation zone as one of the crown jewels of its policy, as outlined by former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at a speech at Stanford University in California, that when it came to a moment of truth, the Trump administration allowed the Assad government, Russia, and to a lesser extent Iran, to take Southwest Syria. Now, over this last month, there's a new team in place, Ambassador Jeffrey and Colonel Rayburn, that are now charged with getting the line to be held by Turkey in Greater Idlib as a means to try to revive the Geneva process and link that to the longer-term U.S. military presence in northern eastern Syria. It's an interesting gambit, and it requires more than just signaling. To this point, as has been mentioned, we've seen the Trump administration try to provide diplomatic top cover for Turkey, to send signals to Russia, to send signals to Iran, and really to send a signal to Europe as well, that there's a different team in place, that there's a different game plan that's being followed, and Northwest Syria is not Southwest Syria. Why is that? The reason for that is if we sort of pull up the strings of the America First foreign policy, really it privileges regional partners to act in the region and to act according to their interests. And then the U.S. comes in to help them or to serve as a force multiplier for their efforts. In Southwest Syria, the Jordanians and Israelis ultimately made the decision that maintaining an opposition zone of control on their borders was not in their best interest if they could cut a deal with the Russians. And we saw how there was this slow motion collapse of the opposition and then very quick collapse once military forces had been engaged. The difference in Northwest Syria is that Turkey is on the ground. Turkey is on the ground with at least hundreds of soldiers that we know about, 12 observation posts, tens of units of heavy artillery, and a major diplomatic effort, including by President Erdogan himself in the Wall Street Journal recently, to state that the line needs to be held in Greater Idlib. Unfortunately, that might not be enough, and the Trump team may have to make the decision that in order to deter this offensive by the Assad government, it will have to do something that no U.S. administration over the course of this conflict has done, which is to protect the population by means of potential military action. Now, to this point, we've had a few statements to that effect. Ambassador Haley recently had made that comment that any offensive could result in U.S. action. And we've heard leaks, I would say strategic leaks, coming from the administration to media, American media, about different types of military responses that would be needed. I would say that in order to deter Bashar al-Assad and his allies from a campaign on Greater Idlib, it will require the U.S. to make it very clear to Russia that there are consequences to Assad's forces for doing that. Already the administration has quietly and publicly said there will be consequences for Russia in terms of the war over the aftermath of the war, as Russia tries to re-normalize Assad and open up spigots of reconstruction assistance, particularly from Europe and the BRIC countries, so it doesn't have to pay for that reconstruction because it can't. The last pillar of the U.S. policy is then, of course, to diminish. If the U.S. succeeds in protecting the population of Greater Idlib, supporting Turkey, and making this point known internationally, you still have the challenge, which as U.S. counter-ISIL envoy Brett McGurk has stated it, Idlib has become the largest al-Qaeda safe haven since 9/11. And the United Nations, in a way, reflects that reference by telling the Assad government in Russia, why are you allowing 10,000 terrorists to risk the lives of 3.5 million people? And by that, they mean Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they also mean Horas ad-Din, they also mean groups such as the Turkmenistan Islamic Party, which is predominantly ethnic Uyghur population, and as we know, there are challenges now with China and how it has treated its Uyghur population, of which potentially 2 million ethnic Uyghurs are being displaced and oppressed. So there are a lot of currents. The major challenge for the United States when it comes to diminishing extremist organizations in Northwest Syria is the Marbling effect. And my colleagues in the panel have mentioned this. Yes, in such formations as the National Liberation Front, you have armed opposition organizations such as the Free Idlib Army, which itself is a coalition of groups that were supported as part of the CIA program, that are potential levers of influence. But you also have such other organizations, such as Ahrar al-Sham, that have, we should say, have had long-standing ties to major Salafi jihadi operatives, and have a vision for an end state of Syria that might not be necessarily congruent with what is envisioned under the Geneva process. So there is a second mission, which is if you've protected the population, you've forced Assad away from Greater Idlib, you still have to get in there and work with Turkey to determine how do you diminish these extremist organizations. Where do you decide to apply military force, predominantly via Syrian armed opposition proxies? Which Syrian armed opposition proxies should you empower to do that? And how do you do it in a way to minimize internal strife and conflict within Greater Idlib that could lead to a smaller scale, but still significant, loss of life and displacement? It's a devil's dilemma for the Trump administration, but I would say that Mr. Trump and his team now have to demonstrate to Turkey and to the world that their current policy and rhetoric is not just a dog and pony show, that they consider this to be a shatter point in U.S. strategy towards Syria and a shatter point for the U.S. presence in Syria moving forward.
Thank you very much. And Kadir, the Turkey's position.
President
Erdogan wrote an op-ed, as Nick mentioned last week, to Wall Street Journal, and he put some red lines, if we can call that, and he called the Idlib operation as the last exit before the toll. And what do you think the possible steps for Turkey in case of an Idlib operation?
Thank you, Kilic. My co-panelists laid it out really well, and they talked about this as well. It is critical in the sense that it will determine the shape of the future of the political negotiation. On the one hand, you can go to a pseudo-political solution where Assad is already controlling pretty much every major city in Syria. It's just rubber stamping, international community rubber stamping, and somehow legitimizing and accepting his rule, and then going towards reconstruction and who's going to pay for it, etc. Or a more meaningful political solution, I'm not saying the most meaningful, but still in comparative terms, where you have an opposition at the table that does somehow reflect the conditions on the ground, and then it creates a counterbalance to the Assad regime in a way that Assad regime is not creating all this chaos. The entry of the regime into Idlib would create a huge humanitarian disaster. Most of it would be borne by Turkey. So both on the level of humanitarian consequences as well as the future of political solution in Syria, Idlib is critical. And of course, each of these main humanitarian and strategic considerations directly impact Turkey. Turkey's military operations in Euphrates Shield and in Afrin have been relatively successful. That territory is being governed with the help of Turkey-backed opposition, by the Turkey-backed opposition. And Turkey hoped to achieve a similar result in Idlib with all the complexities and problems as we mentioned. Of course, we've seen recently Turkey sending reinforcements to these observation posts. That is part of the deconfliction agreement that was arrived at the Astana process. So at the diplomatic level as well, this would signal the end of the Astana process, because it goes against the logic of de-escalation and deconfliction. It will produce hundreds of thousands of refugees, perhaps even millions, depending on how strong and how soon and how much regime goes into Idlib. So it could also be a diplomatic breakdown of that Astana process, at which point Turkey would have to draw a whole new strategy for itself while trying to contain the humanitarian challenges or meet the humanitarian challenges on the ground. For Idlib by itself, of course, is part of a bigger story for Turkey, right? Since the beginning of the revolution, for 7 years, Turkey has been affected by the huge refugee inflows, which also affected Europe. It has consequences not only in the region but beyond, in Europe as well. So this would an explosion basically in Idlib will simply exacerbate that problem, and it also domestically a big issue in Turkey. In the last elections, we saw the opposition use this refugee issue. People are obviously asking the question when they're going to go back, knowing full well most of them may never go back to Syria. But keeping refugees, IDPs on the Syrian side of the border and managing them there, and along the way being able to talk about the return of at least some limited number of refugees, is important for domestic political purposes in Turkey. Of course, there is the recent US policy shift. I think that could help potentially. Depends how it's crafted and whether US will back up its sort of rhetoric. I think the US focus is shifting now away from countering ISIS policy towards a more countering Iran policy. in Syria. That was a discussion for a while that seemed like there was no decision on that one. But the new team signals to me, and the administration's rhetoric signals to me that they will be staying there until they can say that Iranian forces, Iranian proxies are not in Syria anymore. Or this goal, of course, is not achievable in the short or medium term. But if that's the focus for the United States, United States will have to work with Turkey on that, because Turkey deals with Russia at the diplomatic level. Russian air power helps the Assad regime conquer these territories that are supposed to be, de-escalated. But without Iran's help on the ground, Iranian militias, Assad regime by itself cannot take over these territories, or it would be extremely costly, if at all possible. So, U.S. coming in and doing things that would reduce the Iranian influence and outreach and help to the Assad regime would be helpful to Turkey's position. But at the same time, majority of U.S. investment is with the YPG in Northeast, and that's going to continue to be a problem for Turkey. Let me end there, and then can discuss further. Thank you.
Before I open the floor for questions from the audience, I have a few questions. And first, Charles, can you tell us a little bit about HTS, and is it a homogeneous group? I remember you went to the region and write a long piece about the de-escalation zone and potential Turkey strategy over there. And you mentioned that these radical groups can be marginalized and can be broken into pieces. What kind of an organization is the HTS? Is it powerful? Is it consolidated? And what can be a potential way of eradicating HTS without a potential Assad regime airstrikes or offensive?
Well, you've asked the question which I could give a 3-hour answer to, but I'll try and do it briefly. HTS is an extraordinarily complicated movement. It's not homogenous. Certainly it used to be as Nusra, but over time, as it's changed its name, as it's rebranded, as it's tried to double down on convincing the local population that, we're not Al-Qaeda, we're something different. We're not foreign, we are with you, or we are you. As it's gone through that process, it's had to internally, it's been seen internally as having to give a number of concessions. Mm-hmm. So just merely rebranding was seen internally as a concession. By saying publicly that they were breaking ties to any organization, i.e. Al-Qaeda, internally that was seen as a major concession. Coming out of that specific decision, we've seen over the last 12 months a huge public breakup, an airing of all the dirty laundry you can possibly imagine between HTS's leadership and Al-Qaeda's global leadership, in which the consequence or the conclusion is effectively a de facto break between Al-Qaeda's central leadership and HTS. So HTS has qualitatively changed over the last 12 months as a result of that, but not in a constructive way as HTS internally would see it. Why do I say that? Because giving a number of these concessions, I highlighted 2 big ones, but there have been many others. One of them is working with a foreign government. Everyone knows that HTS has been providing security for many of the Turkish army's convoys as they enter Idlib. HTS has given permission to Turkey to be in Idlib. Even just having a relationship with a foreign government has been hugely controversial. Al-Qaeda has said that's tantamount to apostasy, but within HTS there are wings of the group who still refuse to see the legitimacy of that kind of a decision or that kind of a strategy. So basically where we are, to cut a long story short, within HTS is we've got one wing which remains by and large dedicated to what Jabhat al-Nusra was originally committed to, which was being part of Al-Qaeda's global vision, but dedicated to a Syrian mission. And we've got this other wing which is becoming increasingly difficult to measure how much of a minority or a majority it represents, but that is following a trajectory of being willing to engage with certain foreign governments in the region, and there are at least 3 that I'm aware of that HTS has regular dialogue and contact with, that is now beginning to approach internally the idea of outreach to Western governments, believe it or not. I'm aware of several European governments who are considering the idea of a dialogue with HTS, an exploratory dialogue, that consider the idea of cooperating with quote-unquote nationalist groups as entirely legitimate, that consider the idea of cooperating with humanitarian organizations as a necessary and legitimate step, etc., etc. So this quote-unquote more pragmatic wing, which remains a Salafi jihadi extremist organization, but one that is willing to take a somewhat more pragmatic approach to trying to basically secure their long-term survival in Idlib. I mean, they're doing this for a reason, because it allows them, in their eyes, their best chances of survival. But those two wings, whilst remaining within HTS, are very much still pointing in a different direction. So my fear is if there is some potential Idlib operation, those two wings are going to find it very difficult to remain cohesive. Everyone knows the Turks will place the more pragmatic wing under pressure to separate itself from the more hardcore wing and from the even more hardcore groups which remain entirely loyal to Al-Qaeda, like Tanzim Haras al-Din, Ansar Tawhid, potentially the Turkestan Islamic Party, although that's an entirely different and equally intriguing conversation. But the consequences of this is, my way of answering your question is, from my perception and after my last visit to the area, talking with a lot of people involved in this whole kind of community, is that the Turkish strategy was to engage as many actors as possible, so as to establish a relationship of control or influence over all of them, so as to sustain de-escalation, continue stability, but also in this kind of a dynamic to be able to assure that none of those groups spark hostilities themselves, or if hostilities start, those groups respond in a controllable manner that the Turkish military and intelligence services are able to influence. Over time, the longer this has taken, Russia's patience has worn thin. I think basically behind the scenes, Russia has said, well, we can't wait any longer for you, Turkey, to break these groups apart and to separate the wheat from the chaff. And the Iranians and Damascus have always wanted to go full-fledged forward, and Russia is just simply not able to hold them back any longer, particularly now that all the 3 other de-escalation zones have been recaptured. So I think what I was trying to talk about in my opening comments was that the only way of dealing with these groups is, I think, what the Turks have been doing, which is, albeit perhaps logical, extraordinarily dangerous too, because we're dealing with people that, frankly, I don't think any of us can trust. We're not dealing with good guys, we're dealing with bad guys, but trying to control their behavior. And I think that's always going to be an inherently risky strategy, but I think it was almost the only one available to the Turkish government, other than just simply allowing Idlib to be retaken, which, for obvious domestic reasons which have been discussed, was never under consideration. So, short answer, HTS is extremely complicated. I can give lots of anecdotes for just out of interest. Abu Muhammad al-Jalani in recent weeks has been talking internally about his desire to still be the prime minister of liberated northern Syria. So he's not talking about being the emir or the caliph, and he's not talking about the emirate of Idlib or the emirate of Bilad al-Sham. He is talking about becoming the prime minister of liberated northern Syria. So his rhetoric is pointing in a specific direction because A, he's still trying to prove himself as something new. His big hero and idol, which he brings up in many of his meetings, is Che Guevara, not some ancient Islamic revolutionary or military leader. And so he is, this is not me saying he's some moderate nationalist, he's certainly not. But he is a somewhat intriguing personality that has chosen to make a number of, frankly, quite strange risks to continue to try and balance an organization whose ideological spread has broadened over time. My key answer is I don't know how long he can sustain that, and I don't know how long Turkey can continue to control it.
Thank you. Sasha, after listening Nick's presentation and potential options of the US, what would change on the ground and the military strategies of the Assad regime and its allies if there is an involvement of the United States? We don't know what kind of involvement, but if there is a more serious involvement by the United States to Idlib.
Right. So I think first and foremost, again, another marker has been laid down regarding chemical weapons. And that has been that if there's any signal that chemical weapons will be used, there will be a forceful kinetic response from the US. I suspect that could take the form of airstrikes. It could take the form of working more closely with Turkey to support the opposition on the ground. It could also mean that the United States may decide to directly target certain Iranian interests and infrastructure on the ground as a signal to Iran that they're going to bear the brunt of the responsibility for what the regime does. And I say this because I think it's hard to enact a toll, the US to enact a toll on Russia directly, but they can make this very costly for Iran on the ground if they choose to do so. I also think it depends on the evolving relationship between the United States and Turkey currently. Now that, as Nick pointed out, we have a new team. The ambassador who was just appointed, he is very familiar and has a high degree of expertise regarding Turkish politics. He knows all the players. I think he's pretty well regarded within Turkey. So he might have the personal connections and the flexibility to craft a more positive relationship that could result in closer cooperation. Also, Turkey is still part of NATO. They have Turkish forces in these observation posts. This past 13 days, there have been artillery barrages and airstrikes all up and down the periphery of Idlib, and it's very notable that they all make sure not to come too close to any observation post. To borrow some words from Charles earlier today, we were discussing all of this is signaling. The regime and Iran and Russia are signaling to Turkey, look, we can get very close to you. We're choosing not to. We're choosing to see where's the line. The other real question, which none of us will know until it happens, is who will make the first move? Let's say the regime attempts a ground invasion, but they don't have Russian air support. Perhaps Turkey and Russia come to an agreement, or Russia decides it wants to maintain a positive, forceful relationship with Turkey, and they'll just tell Turkey, we're not going to involve ourselves. Well, the regime has to make a decision about whether they want to engage in physical clashes with the Turkish military or simply avoid them. If they choose to avoid them, that puts Turkey in another position. If you see a column of regime forces entering Idlib and they're within basically earshot of a Turkish observation post and Turkish military forces do not fire upon them, then that's also another signal that maybe Turkey is not prepared to defend the pocket. As of now, given the amount of Turkish military reinforcements to the different observation posts, including a number of observation posts that are not they're hard to defend, let's say, I would say for now, Turkey's willing to defend the pocket. But I think both Russia and Iran and the regime are going to test that to see how far they can go. And part of that test is going to see, is the United States really with Turkey? Are they ready to support Turkey no matter what the outcome? Or is also there a stopping point for how far the US is willing to go moving forward?
Nick, we are talking about a new team. Is this the team, or are we going to have more interagency issues among different agencies in the US about the Syria policy? Can this new team basically design now a Syria policy for the United States?
So I think it's unpredictable what will occur in the future, just because we don't know what the final decision point will be if the Assad government and its Russian and Iranian allies decide to test U.S. and Turkish resolve. It does seem that the new team has placed a particular emphasis on this moment and on this decision point regarding Greater Idlib, because it's viewed as being the last line for the Geneva process, which is on life support in many ways. And it's difficult to have a credible Syrian opposition-led alternative authority to be there at the negotiating table if there is no Syrian opposition majority-held area, which takes you to sort of the broader strategic picture, which is, if you look at the map that Sasha and his team expertly designed, you see a zone stretching from the desert of Deir ez-Zor all the way to the mountain of Latakia. That's, for all intents and purposes, a NATO-type zone. And if you take that map and you think broadly, when we talk about the larger process that's involved with Syria, I mean, at the end of the day, it is fundamentally going to be about how does the United States demonstrate to the Russians that it is significantly invested in Syria enough to be there for the long haul for Geneva-like end state to occur, which means Assad is well on his way to being transitioned out of power, or is transitioned out of power along with significant elements of his intelligence and military regime, along with Iranian proxy Shia jihadi forces also being withdrawn before U.S. forces withdrawn. You've heard senior administration officials, including Secretary of Defense Mattis, referring to that the end state vision is in fact the Geneva process and U.S. forces will be withdrawn based on the conditions working towards that. You don't have that if you don't have a contiguous zone from Deir ez-Zor to Latakia, which is sort of the broader picture. The challenge is there's steps that have to occur along that way. The U.S. has demonstrated that in defense of the heroic SDF, it will protect its zone and that it will protect the deconfliction zone that it has made with Russia in northern and eastern Syria. The question is, will it protect Greater Idlib to support its Turkish NATO ally? And if it's able to protect that zone, then what? And this is where the interagency questions might come into play. Because the then what is, how do you empower Turkey to empower the Syrian opposition to determine who are the actors that need to be diminished or defeated or destroyed within Greater Idlib? And that has always been a challenge. Sasha, Charles, and myself were part of a larger group that created a strategy early last year to combat al-Qaeda in Syria. And in our discussions, just that point, how do you determine which organizations and which elements of the population within Greater Idlib or Northwest Syria need to be confronted, need to be diminished, need to be taken from power or potentially destroyed is highly controversial. There's a reason why Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is where it is. There's a reason why we have questions concerning, for example, Ahrar al-Sham. There's a reason why there's a certain controversy around certain groups that flared up, such as Jabhat al-Shamiyya and others. It's because the awful truth of the Syrian conflict, and particularly in northwest Syria, is there are significant elements of the Syrian local opposition that have been problematic. And yes, there is a greater humanitarian need to protect the lives of 3.5 million people, to not create another wave of displacement that could have should have big effects for Turkey, could potentially have effects for Europe. But also there's another question that follows that, which is going to be the most difficult, which is if you have that moment to take advantage of, how do you do it? And who, at the end of the day, do you have to designate as the enemy? And that, I think, will create the most challenges.
Kadir, very shortly, do you think Turkey and US can work in Syria together? Because there is, we had so many panels on Turkey-US relation here, and each and every time there is this trust question. And in terms of Syria, that trust is really thin due to US support for YPG, due to the failure of train and equip operations, due to the red line statement and lack of commitment. Do you think they can work together at this point?
You and I would like to always emphasize that there are opportunities that they can work together. They can build upon, and I think those exist. The problem is, are they going to be able to take advantage of that, and are there willing teams on both sides to come up with a common strategy? And we shouldn't have accidents and tweets that would just basically take the ball off the court and nobody can play. That happened with the sanctions against Turkey. But I think people like James Jeffrey are quite focused on Iran, right? And they've been arguing for an anti-Iran sort of alliance, and they would like to include Turkey, and they understand Turkey's issues with Iran in the geopolitical sense. They're good economic partners, but so I think that kind of coming together may happen, but at a, let's say, minimal way. I don't think Turkey will sign up to a full-fledged anti-Iran front. That doesn't make sense strategically. Doesn't make economic sense either. But doesn't mean they can't work together, starting with Idlib. So Idlib, we've had very high-level officials from the U.S. government warning the Assad regime we got the chemical weapons use part. Okay, there will definitely be a response. How kinetic? How strong? But are they going to be okay with some conventional sort of warfare? And they have created, I think, enough doubt right now. But they're gonna have to build on it, because I think that's giving Russia a little bit of a pause. But I'm not sure if that's gonna be enough. So that's something that Turkey sorry to make this longer, but if US can actually enable Turkey to keep Idlib on the opposition column, then they can really have a serious conversation about a common Syria strategy.
Thank you very much. And now I can open the floor for questions. Please identify yourself, and then we start with the gentleman at the back.
Hi, John Lechner. Thank you very much to the panel. I guess this is a question to just take advantage of Charles' expertise. To what extent do you know the percentage of foreign fighters among the population in Idlib? And of that, do you have any indication of how many of those are Russian-speaking or Russian fighters that Russia is very interested in fighting on the territory of Idlib, rather than potentially seeing them come back home? And if you know by any chance, to what extent do you see that as a motivating factor for them?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, thank you for your question. It is an important motivating factor. Well, it's either a motivating factor or it's an internal justification for the Russians. But numbers are very difficult to measure. But I would say, HTS is the largest single armed group, not in an umbrella, which is the NLF that I mentioned earlier, and they're probably about 20 to 25% foreign fighters now. They used to be higher than that in former names, but they saw many foreigners leave to join the more loyalist Al-Qaeda factions that I mentioned earlier. But if I was to give you a very, very rough estimate of foreign fighters present in northwestern Syria, it would be 7,000 or 8,000. How many Russians? Much less than there used to be again. There were a whole swathe of relatively small Russian-speaking jihadi groups that were actually some of the first jihadi groups to emerge in Syria, and they all started in Latakia and Aleppo and Idlib in 2012. But many of them have actually left the country. They were, through a variety of means, I assume, given an ability to leave. Why did they leave? Because many of these guys have this kind of mercenary lifestyle whereby they never saw themselves entirely as dedicated to the Syrian cause for life, but they were there to lend assistance up until a certain point. Many of them also came from or were linked to Russian-speaking diaspora communities, including in Turkey itself. So many of the Russians have actually left, but it's almost impossible to measure that number. Of any organization that probably has the most foreign fighters, you'd also need to talk about the Turkestan Islamic Party, which has been mentioned already. Frankly, they're a kind of fascinating group as well, which by and large also abides by this kind of mercenary mindset. They're not majority Uyghur, although they used to be. They've actually localized significantly over the last 12 to 18 months. They've got a very significant number of Syrian fighters because they have access to funds from outside the country. They've also been one of the other groups that the Turkish government has chosen to try to engage with to control their behavior. The reason why I single out the TIP is because they are also an interesting case for geopolitical reasons. So behind the scenes, the Chinese have been sending fairly strong signals both to Ankara but also to Moscow and to Damascus that the TIP specifically needs to be dealt with. Now, albeit not being a majority Uyghur organization, they're the largest Uyghur armed group contiguously active in anywhere in the world, apparently larger than in Afghanistan, Pakistan, which is where their previous headquarters were. So the Chinese are putting all of these various actors under very heavy pressure to deal with the TIP. About a week ago, I was abroad, so I've kind of lost all sense of dates, but maybe 7 to 10 days ago, there was like almost a whole day of bombing around Jisr al-Shogor and Badama near the northwestern Turkish border, which is where the TIP is headquartered. I find it very hard to imagine that wasn't a coincidence. That was a message to the TIP that they either needed to leave, i.e. leave Syria, or they needed to escalate conflict retaliatorily, and then thus singling them out for conflict. So I think the Chinese are putting heavy pressure using economic areas of leverage on all of these different actors to deal with the TIP. But yeah, 6,000 to 8,000 maximum in the northwest.
So, gentlemen.
Yeah, Dan Liebman, I'm a writer. Yeah, we talk about the catastrophe that could occur if the Syrian forces invade, but we don't talk about the possible catastrophe if things remain as they are. How will all these conflicting forces who don't seem to get along with each other, vying for power, provide the necessary services in Idlib? As far as I know, I do believe the Syrian government was providing administrative salaries to teachers in both Aleppo and Idlib, and keeping services going in both of these provinces. And of course, since they use the word liberation of Aleppo and other territories, things seem very stabilized. There's been a lot of rebuilding. There doesn't seem to be any complaints. So it seems to me the problem isn't so much that the Syrians are going to invade their own territory. It seems the problem is that these foreign forces, aided by foreign elements, are staying there, that they are the problem. And why aren't we concerned about that?
I'm sure everyone wants to answer that. I'll just put a tidbit in. Listen, you're right in a sense to say that Idlib is being held hostage by foreign/terrorist elements. They are, but those foreign/terrorist elements represent less than 0.5% of all of the people in Idlib. So to justify what you're suggesting, which would be the regime's liberation of Idlib based on the fate or the problem being posed by less than 0.5% of over 3 million people, would be a problematic issue from a human rights concern when you look at how those liberations have taken place. So that's one issue that I would be particularly keen to highlight. But also, there's been no rebuilding in Aleppo, very little. Not rebuilding of buildings, there's been cleaning up. Look at the old city of Homs. The BBC sent one of their chief foreign correspondents to Homs. The old city of Homs was liberated, 3 years ago?
3.5, yeah.
It has been untouched. Zero rebuilding. It was completely depopulated. The BBC couldn't find a single person in the old ancient city of Homs, part of the city of Homs. So again, that's kind of a little bit of a misnomer or disinformation from the regime side. There's a reason why there's been no reconstruction, because the regime is broke. And the Russians and the Iranians have made it patently clear we are not paying for Syria's reconstruction. So we have to take a little bit more of a long-term purview here and look at some of the realities on the ground. But I'm sure colleagues
Sasha,
have
you
more
want
to
to say
say.
something?
I mean, realistically, if you look at the other areas where the de-escalation zones, which were forcibly dismantled by the regime, and you start asking people what happened to those populations that stayed. In eastern Ghouta and the Damascus suburbs area, you hear stories about scores of people being detained and disappeared, scores of people being conscripted into the regime's military, and many other people simply being forced into these quote-unquote temporary shelters in which men between the age of basically 15 and 55 can't leave the compound. So for the people who choose to stay, who are in opposition-held areas that get retaken by the regime, the future is very bleak, it's very uncertain, and there's no way for the international community, the UN, who are physically on the ground, the UN have headquarters in Damascus, cannot guarantee these people's safety, which is why a certain percentage of the people from these de-escalation zones chose to go to Idlib rather than stay under regime control, either because the risk was very high to their personal safety or their families, or simply because they didn't think living under the regime was a viable option given what's happened to other people and other populations. In terms of social service provision, since the Idlib pocket in various forms has been out of the regime's hands since roughly 2012, you had a number of dynamic civil society organizations and local governance structures jerry-rigged together social service provision and local governance systems that have provided up until now assistance and support with the help of the international community. The United States government is, I still believe, to be the single largest humanitarian aid provider to Syria, and they have been providing consistent aid and humanitarian support to the civil society organizations and the humanitarian actors on the ground who are providing education, health services, electricity, food, and those other things. So there is a system there. It's piecemeal, it's a patchwork, but it has sustained 3 million people up until now.
Just going to add very quickly, I think Charles and Sasha addressed your question very well in regard to the Assad government and the way it tries to institute social services in the aftermath of conflict in different areas around the country. The question you ask, I do think, is important for us all to consider in regard from the Turkish perspective, in that if the United States decides to deter a campaign from the Assad government and its allies in Greater Idlib, part of the diminishment of the extremist organizations is how do you provide social services and order, essentially, for the population, not only of Idlib, but of Euphrates Shield and potentially of Afrin. We've seen that there is an interesting way in which Turkey has administered Euphrates Shield and is beginning to administer Afrin that is distinct from Greater Idlib. And the question then becomes, if you have the aftermath of deterrence as part of the diminishment of these extremist organizations, to what degree does Turkey incorporate Greater Idlib into the administration that it's constructed in these other zones? Because that then speaks to another question, which is fundamentally how long can a regime that's based on Ba'athist Arab nationalist principles, that's based in Damascus, suffer a Turkish-led zone in northern Syria, considering it already believes ideologically that it had lost Hatay, for example, in Al-Iskandarun. And so there's this historical, geopolitical element that gets woven into that, because we have, over the last year and a half, seen the beginnings of a Turkish-led administration for areas of northwest Syria that are outside the rule of Assad and his government.
Professor,
Can I just add one
yeah,
thing?
just
That question also assumes that reassertion of regime control is somehow the same thing as Syrian sovereignty, which I think is not the case, because as they mentioned, as panelists mentioned, the places that are taken over by the regime are first thing they do is depopulate them. So the Syrian sovereignty coming at the expense of actual Syrian citizens, that's not, and then it's being not necessarily being replaced by a faction of the Syrian people, but also a huge, undue, outsized, let's say, influence of actors like Iran and others, right? So your question came from a sort of perspective that seems to suggest, Syrian government takeover at the end of the day will mean Syrian sovereignty, but that's just not the case.
Professor Server.
Daniel Serwer, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I want to ask a dumb question. I don't quite understand what's happening right now. We seem to be in a moment of hesitation. Is there actually an agreed pause going on? Are the Turks separating what they regard as extremists from relative moderates? What's actually...
What's happening?
What's happening?
Okay. I will collect another question by the gentleman over there and another one, then we'll answer them together.
Hello, I'm Flint Arthur. I have a question because last week the analyst Fabrice Belange said that most likely Turkey will transfer the jihadists to Afrin, and that this would be the best way for Turkey to protect Afrin from the comeback of the Kurds. Can I get the panel's thoughts on the likelihood of that and its implications for Syria?
Thank you. And there's another gentleman.
Yusuf Yagmor. My two questions to Dr. Kadir. Is Turkey looking at this as a humanitarian crisis that it's trying to avert, or is it an issue of national security to Turkey because the response would be completely different depending on how they assess the risk. My second question is, how far is Turkey prepared to go in confronting Russia and Iran in this conflict? The issue isn't about land forces that are going to stop what the Syrians and the Iranians might do. It's about air assault, and how can you stop that?
Okay, thank you. So, Professor Server's question, what is happening? Who wants to answer that question?
I'll shoot, you go second.
Sure.
Or you go first. You go first.
So, big picture, I think when we look at the signals on the ground, number one, Turkey has moved sufficient military resources in place to at least tell the Russians, we're not going to let this go without an extended negotiation at the very minimum. And at the maximum, we're willing to fight and defend the pocket. The second signal that I think is very important is this discussion of moving the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army from Afrin to Idlib to help defend the pocket. We have heard numbers that they might move as many as 20,000 forces from Afrin to the Idlib pocket. And if you add that with the around 15 to 20,000 or even maybe 25,000 fighters under the National Liberation Front, you have a sizable force capable of defending the pocket. The tricky part, again, is command and control. And if they can figure out how to deal with the dynamics of that complex environment, and everyone has to hold the line simultaneously. In terms of, again, Russia, I think Russia bombed from September 3rd until about the 9th. They bombed the entire south of Idlib. They bombed the entire opposition-held area of Hama. They had artillery barrages in Latakia around where TIP is based. They had artillery barrages in Aleppo, again, to signal we're here and we're ready to play potentially if we need to. But in the last 2 days, bombings have decreased, airstrikes have lessened. That may also be a signal that Russia has an interest to, again, continue negotiations to see what they can get before they either make a decision not to provide air cover or to provide air cover, or simply exert pressure on the regime not to move forward with its invasion. The big spoiler, as usual, is Iran, and we never know what exactly they're planning on doing.
Charles, what do you want to add?
Five things, which I'll do really briefly,
Okay.
that I think are all happening all at the same time. One is the Turks have been sending in, and it was reported by Reuters yesterday, but it's been going on for a while, been sending in more ammunition and weapons to the National Liberation Front, which I talked about earlier. That's a signal, but it also has, real-world effects. It allows some of these groups to exert their own levels of deterrence on specific targeted front lines. The other thing that's going on is HTS remains internally or continues to be internally engaged in the discussion about how they are going to fix this problem. They're well aware internally that they are the kind of core reason for why an offensive is likely to start. They're also well aware that they may potentially hold the cards to prevent one, or at least to limit one. So they continue to be engaged about the idea of, do they dissolve, which is the Turkish order, which I don't think is going to happen? Do they join the National Liberation Front, which may just about please the Russians, will never convince Damascus and Iran? Or do they preemptively attack the regime and force the issue and create a conflict that everyone thinks is going to happen anyway? So HTS is internally deliberating. The third thing, which is, I guess, still a theory, but I think holds some weight, is that the regime itself is still struggling to bring or to deploy enough manpower to take Idlib as a whole. Idlib is not southwestern Syria. Idlib is certainly not East Ghouta or Aleppo or Homs. It is a huge military undertaking, a very mountainous terrain, very deeply embedded armed resistance movement, plus a potentially hostile external actor. There's talk of 20 to 25,000 pro-regime forces ringing the area, but the suggestion that the Russians think that's not enough. There's ongoing efforts elsewhere in the country to forcefully conscript young men, mostly from reconciled areas, and shipping them up north and making them fight their former opposition partners. So there's the manpower issue. The fourth one is really a point. Russia has always, as far as I'm aware, engaging with Russians who work on the Syrian file, have always opposed the idea of an all-out campaign on Idlib. Why? Because they're aware that they, more than anyone else, will be the actor that has to determine whether that campaign is successful or not. And they don't want to bear the brunt of the consequences, particularly now that the US is signaling potential military repercussions. So the fourth one is, are the Russians placing the regime under pressure to hold off, give the Turks more time to try to solve the issue themselves? And the fifth one is, there are ongoing, very secretive back-channel negotiations to reconcile specific groups and commanders located in peripheral areas, particularly in southern Idlib and northern Hama, to basically start what happened in southwestern Syria. You started with some limited reconciliation agreements, which created a kind of crisis of confidence within the opposition, which eventually led to an all-out surrender of the area to the regime. So those are the 5 things that are all going on all at the same time. I'm sure there are many others. We can all watch the small group meeting that happened in Geneva, which involved the US, the UK, France, Germany, Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, and everyone else. Maybe everyone is watching to see what comes out of that. Yeah, as with all things Idlib, it's extremely complicated, many moving parts.
I just would add one quick point. That last point that Charles raises, I think, is extremely important. This issue of, can you establish some sort of reconciliation regime with particular armed opposition commanders? As he referenced in the Southwest de-escalation zone, when one particular armed opposition commander, Ahmed al-Odeh, decided to accept the reconciliation deal, he essentially took an entire third of that zone off the table for military action, which then led to a cascade effect that essentially led to the collapse of the armed opposition. And there are other factors, but that's important. So the dynamic there, however, is in the 2 areas where Russia or the regime may be most interested in getting reconciled groups, the Western Aleppo countryside and in the eastern areas of Latakia and Greater Idlib, are some of the most difficult places for them to get those agreements because of the nature of the groups that are there on the ground. In the Western Aleppo countryside, you have a coalition of groups that are particularly powerful and have a lot of legitimacy, at least in their areas. And in the eastern areas of Latakia, you have a number of jihadi organizations that would rather fight than they can't reconcile with the regime. There's no other option for them. So that reconciliation track is very important to watch for, because if there are successes with that track, then there may be another type of agreement in place between the Russians and the Turks. But how do you even subdivide Greater Idlib up in a way that prevents mass humanitarian crisis?
Charles, do you want to answer the gentleman's question? Is Turkey trying to move some groups to Afrin to consolidate its rule over there? Or?
I mean, I think as Sasha pointed to, I do think that's a possibility. Although, frankly, engaging a lot with some of the core international community actors who've operated for a long time in relationships, civil, military, and political, in northwestern Syria, their assessment is that if things go as badly as many people fear, that the Turkish government will have no option but to open the border. So the fear is that the numbers will be so bad, there is just simply no way that you can move around 1 million people along a local road all the way through to northern Aleppo's countryside, particularly given the risks that Sasha talked about whether or not designated terrorist organizations may have a presence within that displaced population. So whilst I think Afrin is an option, there'll be international resistance to it for the reasons that Nick talked about, given the displacement of the Kurdish population. But the big one will be whether or not the Turks will have to open up the border. Armed groups, so you said jihadists, which is a term that Fabrice Bolanche uses. I would say that groups on the more moderate end of the spectrum who have affiliated wings already in Afrin and northern Aleppo in the Euphrates Shield areas, very possible that they may end up being moved to those areas because they have a very solid relationship with the Turkish government. But jihadists, to use that term, would, in my mind, mean designated terrorist organizations. That I don't think is a likelihood, no.
Yeah.
And Kadir, gentleman's question, the Idlib sensitivity of Turkey, is it because of the humanitarian issues or national security concerns, or should I say both? Which one?
Just say one sentence about this. I think the question was assuming that Turkey needed to defend Afrin against Kurds, and they could do that with the so-called jihadists. So I think that's not, one of the important things for Turkey is not to change. It's been talking about not engineering demography in these areas. one of the things that YPG did was to dislocate, just like the regime, right? Dislocate large populations, civilian populations, so that they could have control. I don't think they want to import sort of non-Afrin people necessarily there. But as a consequence of a humanitarian crisis, if they end up there, that, like Charles said, I think they're going to have to manage that. I think humanitarian concerns and national security have been woven into each other for a long time now for Turkey. Initially, Turkey adopted a very humanitarian policy, opened the border, a lot of refugees came in, but that didn't stop the border security issues, let alone many bombs were falling from the Syrian side into the border towns of Turkey. So part of the rationale for Euphrates Shield operation was to push both ISIS and YPG away from the border. So I think when Turkey looks at Idlib, I outlined it as humanitarian and strategic concerns, but I think they're not necessarily clear-cut separate. They both have implications for the other, one or the other. And then confronting Russia and Iran question, if I may, I think Turkey is already doing that. I think ideal scenario for Russia is, regime kind of takes over without much noise from outside, and we get to reconstruction, which the West should be paying for. So that scenario is not happening because of Turkey is confronting this both on the ground and at the diplomatic level, right? We saw the Tehran meeting, which was televised. Turkish side says they weren't even aware of it, but you saw Turkey sort of say the same things that it says in public to the leaders there as well. But when, I don't think Turkey is in a quest to fight, let's say, Iranian, forces on the ground, or Assad regime forces on the ground for that matter. It may end up happening as a happenstance, but I don't think Turkey is seeking war there, but trying to make sure that Idlib is not taken over by, let's step back for a second. Remember, Turkey sees Assad regime as a destabilizing force, right? Wherever it goes, it commits war crimes, it uses chemical weapons, it produces millions of refugees, and it gets along really well with, ISIS and some Al-Qaeda groups, as long as it fits their strategic sort of purposes. So they are able to make those moves. Turkey sees the regime as a destabilizing force. So it is extremely important that Idlib is not taken over by regime for that purpose as well, for that reason.
Thank you very much. It is 3:31, 1 minute late. And please join me. Thank you for coming, and please join me to congratulate our successful panel.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.